Today's lecture is going to be the simple, what is biology? This is an organismal biology class, so let's understand what we're going to be studying for the rest of the semester. So biology is simply the science of studying living things. We can break biology down into its different parts, which has origins in Greek. So bios means life, and logia or ology is the study of. So for us, this is the study of life. This is an image of a blue-tongued skink. So what does biology examine exactly? Biology examines the following attributes of living things. So the structure and the function of living things, which happens to be a big idea, one of the 5 big ideas in biology. The growth and origin of living things, the evolution and the distribution of living things, and then finally the classification of these living things, also called systematics. So we can say that biology is the study of life, and that seems pretty easy to remember and recognize, but I want us to think a little bit more deeply about the definition of life. What is life? It might surprise you to learn that there's actually no one clear-cut standard definition of life. There are actually many definitions of life that exist. And a lot of these definitions serve specific functions for specific agencies. So for example, NASA has its very own definition of life because in searching for life on other planets, on exoplanets outside of our solar system, they have to have a definition of what they're looking for in order to say, yes, we have found life, or no, we have not found life. Regardless of the specific definition, which I hope you will read the articles that are posted in this week's module that we'll be discussing next week, regardless of the specific definition, there are different properties of life that we've come to recognize, at least on life on this planet. Okay, so the first thing is order. Living things are organized and composed of one or more cells, and a cell represents the basic unit of life. This is organized in the following way. So cells are composed of organelles. Those cells then make up tissues. Tissues make up organs, and organ systems make up entire organisms. Now, you can still be a living thing and still remain a single cellular form of life. You're still living at that point. This is just the different ways in which life can be organized. The second property of life is response to a stimulus, an external stimulus in the environment. This is often expressed by motion, so the organism decides to move around or moving to or away from a stimulus. So there are different examples that you're probably very familiar with. For us, we tend to close our eyes when there's a bright light shining. That is a response to a stimulus of a light. But looking out into nature, we have the example of geotropism and phototropism in plants. Geotropism is a tendency for plants to respond to gravity. So here, the top left image, roots tend to grow towards the earth, so towards the center of the earth. That is called positively geotropic. You can break down geotropic into geo, which is earth or rock, and tropic meaning seeing. Phototropism is sort of exactly what it sounds. If you understand what geotropism is, you can guess what phototropism is, and that's responding to light instead of gravity. An additional example is something that bacteria possess. This is the potential to perform chemotaxis. Okay, so chemo, we can break this word down. Chemo means chemical, and taxis means movement. So they are moving in response to a chemical. We call these different chemicals either chemoattractants, so the microbial organism will be attracted to the chemical, or a chemorepellent that chemical is repelling the microorganism. We have another property of life in reproduction, and this is the passing of genes or hereditary material to the next generation, either sexually or asexually. So we probably, when we think about reproduction, we automatically think about sexual reproduction. This involves two parents, each of which have different types of gametes. These gametes are also called sex cells. Males have sperm and females have ova. Ova means egg. Gametes will join during fertilization, and the resulting offspring is not genetically identical to either parent. There's some sort of recombination that occurs during the fertilization and growth process. Sexual reproduction is common in more complex forms of life, like mammals, reptiles, and humans, of course. In addition to sexual reproduction, we also have asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction actually only involves one parent, and there are no gametes that are being released. Therefore, there's no fertilization to take place. There's only cell division that produces offspring. And what's interesting is that the offspring are genetically identical to the parent. So they're actually clones of the parent. Asexual reproduction is most common in simpler forms of life like yeast and bacteria. Another property of life is adaptation. Adaptation is the alteration in biological functions or behavior in response to the environment. So we'll go over some of the examples here. One example includes a coevolution between an orchid plant and a specific giant moth that lives in Madagascar. Now, there's a story about Charles Darwin being sent a specimen of an orchid with a very, very, very long neck, as you can see here. Okay, and so at the bottom of that neck is the nectar. And so Charles Darwin looked at this orchid and he was so surprised at the anatomy of this orchid and said, surely the type of pollinator that feeds on this nectar must have a very, very long proboscis in order to have this orchid propagate itself. It needs a pollinator, and therefore that pollinator was predicted to have a very, very long tongue or proboscis. It wasn't until many, many years later that the moth that was the pollinator for this specific orchid was actually discovered. And so through the knowing about evolution and coevolution between different plants, Charles Darwin was able to make a prediction about what the pollinator looked like for that orchid, and it actually was found, which is a really exciting story. So moving beyond that example, we also can look at people's blood. So those who live at higher altitudes, like people from Tibet, they're experiencing very low oxygen levels in their environment. High altitude environments, there's lower pressure, so there's less oxygen in the air. And so oxygen is what gives us fuel to breathe. It's how we respire as humans. And I don't know if any of you have done any hiking at higher elevations, but it's often very easy to get winded. You get out of breath, you can't catch your breath simply because you're not used to such low oxygen concentrations in the air around you. But people who grew up living in this type of environment for generation after generation, they've actually adapted their type of hemoglobin that they have. They have elevated hemoglobin in their bodies to grab up as much oxygen as possible. And so their bodies have adapted physiologically to the absence of a lot of oxygen in their environment. And finally, a pretty cute example are emperor penguin behavior in Antarctica. They'll actually huddle together in order to keep warm during the winter. So this is a behavioral adaptation amongst the penguins. Another property of life is growth and development. Organisms grow and develop as a result of genes that provide distinct instructions on how to grow cellularly and then develop throughout their entire life. And this next anecdote just really drives home the point that we do grow and develop from very early stages in our lives. And so this is an anecdote. The irascible genius J.B.S. Haldane, one of the three leading architects of neo-Darwinism, was once challenged by a lady after a public lecture. This is a word of mouth anecdote, and the exchange went something like this. So the evolution skeptic comes up to the microphone and says, Professor Haldane, even given the billions of years that you say we were available for evolution, I simply cannot believe it's possible to go from a single cell to a complicated human body with trillions of cells organized into bones and muscles and nerves, a heart that pumps without ceasing for decades, miles and miles of blood vessels and kidney tubules, and a brain capable of thinking and talking and feeling. And he simply replied and said, but madam, you did it yourself, and it only took 9 months. And so let that sink in for a little bit. So that's crossing these ideas of evolution through geologic time, and also the idea of humans growing and developing from conception through adulthood. Another property of life is regulation, also called homeostasis. This is the ability to maintain internal conditions within a narrow range. This is things like temperature, osmotic state, and pH. We also call homeostasis steady state, simply because you're maintaining a quasi-steady state. Your temperature during the day might fluctuate, this and that, but altogether, it really remains the same. There are different examples. One of my favorites actually is a salt gland that seabirds have right above their eye. This allows them to drink salt water. So you and I, we can't drink salt water. It's actually very, very dehydrating. If we drink too much salt water, we get sores, we lose our osmotic balance, and we can actually get really sick or die. But seabirds, because they live at the sea and their primary source of available water is seawater, they have adapted this way to maintain their internal salt content by concentrating that salt in their salt gland. And they actually have a special duct that lets that salt water fall out of their beak. So it's like they're crying really, really salty tears, but that helps them maintain their inner osmotic pressure and salt content. Another example that you might be more familiar with is thick fur and layers of fat under the skin in polar bears. And here's an image of a beautiful polar bear. What you may not know actually is, this is just a fun fact, is that their fur is actually not white. It's clear. You can fact check me on that. That's what somebody in an Arctic symposium told me. But I found that to be very, very interesting. And finally, this is something you might be more familiar with. Shivering is a response to regulating our body temperature. So once our body temperature begins to drop, we tend to generate heat by the act of shivering. So this is a way to regulate your internal body temperature. Another property of life, a very, very important one, is energy processing. All living organisms, whether they're on the microscopic scale or the macro scale, all of them use a source of energy for metabolism. The source of energy can vary. So autotrophs, for example, they capture energy from the sun and convert it into chemical energy for food. This is a process of photosynthesis, whereby sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water is turned into sugar, glucose, and oxygen. But in addition to photosynthesis, we also have heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are on the other end of the spectrum, where they use chemical energy in molecules that they take in for food. So this is basically the opposite, where we're taking that sugar, we're breaking it down with the use of an electron acceptor, usually oxygen for aerobic organisms, and converting it back to carbon dioxide. And finally, evolution is the 8th property of life. This is simply the accumulation of adaptations by natural selection of random mutations that allow organisms to increase their reproductive success in an environment over geological time. Another term for reproductive success is also called fitness. So an organism that is fit is one that's able to survive and reproduce. That is the basic definition of fitness, being able to survive and reproduce, pass your genes on to the next generation. And as you'll notice throughout the rest of the semester, all of the topics and the 5 big ideas in biology. They really center around the idea of biological evolution. And it has been said by Theodosius Dobzhansky that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. So all of those other properties of life, all of those are consequences of natural selection, of random mutations that increase fitness, or the consequence of evolution. So let's move beyond these properties of life and take a look at some things that you might have questions about if it's alive or not. And some of these are actually still under debate right now. So viruses, what we're dealing with right now, actually with COVID-19, is the proliferation of the coronavirus. It's a type of virus. And the big question is, are viruses alive? So if we take a look at the basic properties of a virus is simply a microscopic particle of genetic material. This genetic material can be either DNA or RNA, and it's contained within an organic particle or a capsid. So it houses the DNA inside of that head right there. Here. They invade living cells, and the only way that viruses can reproduce is by hijacking the machinery of their host. So they actually can't make a new generation of themselves without using somebody else's machinery. They can't reproduce on their own. And so therefore, this is why viruses are not considered alive by most researchers. There are those who study what we call giant viruses, who have actually accumulated throughout their lineage different ancillary genes. So it's not just a simple amount of DNA and RNA inside of a capsid, it's actually picked up genes from different hosts. And in some way it can perform metabolism on a rudimentary scale. And so this is really pushing the boundaries of what we consider life to be, which is very, very interesting. So moving on to things that we know with more certainty that are alive, we consider bacteria to be alive. They are microscopic. They are unicellular, and these can reproduce and metabolize all on their own. So here are some lovely images of Geobacter, which is a gram-negative bacterium with a bunch of pili. It can use these pili for getting energy from mineral surfaces, which is actually really exciting and a new frontier of research in microbiology. And we have here a TEM image, a transmission electron microscope image of E. coli. And these are just a few of the different types of metabolic activities that different microbes can perform. So you have methanogens, which are a type of archaea, not a bacterium, but an archaean. And we'll talk about the different domains of life moving forward in the class. But for right now, the methanogens, we can break down their name into methano, so methane, and gen, meaning to generate. So these microorganisms, through their metabolism, generate methane, which is CH4. We have acetogens, which you can probably guess produce or generate something that we would call aceto. Aceto stands for acetate. So these microorganisms are autotrophs that convert CO2 into acetate. They generate acetate. And then sulfate reducing bacteria, as their name suggests, they reduce sulfate. And a way to think about this is that these microorganisms, instead of breathing oxygen, they're breathing sulfate, which is represented as SO4 2-. They reduce this sulfate, they stick electrons onto it and turn it into hydrogen sulfide, H2S. Moving on to fungi. These are a very, very diverse group of, could be, a microscopic organism. You might be more familiar with the macroscopic type of fungi in mushrooms, but you can actually have microscopic types of fungi in yeast, like what we use to brew beer. Beer is brewed with a fungus called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So fungi may or may not be microscopic. They can be both unicellular and multicellular, and they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. And of course, they metabolize on their own, and they display all of the properties of life that we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. And so fungi are definitely alive. But I want you to keep thinking about this question. Is it alive? What is our definition of life? Where are we going in the next frontier of research in determining what life is, what life is not? And I have created a TED Ed lecture for you all to go through and answer the questions and start thinking about this. And so this is Dr. Karen Lloyd. She's a principal investigator on several really exciting grants taking a look at the definition of life in different extremophile environments. She's at the University of Tennessee in the Department of Microbiology, and her TED Talk is titled, "This Deep Sea Mystery is Changing Our Understanding of Life." And so I want you to access this video. It's about 13 to 15 minutes long. There's some questions and then just a prompt to get you to think a little bit more and bring some of those thoughts to our discussions about the papers next week.